Welcome to Civil Discourse, a podcast where participants are free to share their ideas, empathize with other perspectives, and who intend to advance to a better solution to fix a societal ill. We will focus on topics that are particularly complicated. In a time where information is from sources more opinionated than ever, our mission is to find solutions and goals to accelerate the nation's progress with cultural impunity. I'm your host, Todd Furniss. Welcome to today's edition of Civil Discourse hosted by Todd Furniss. I'm Todd Furniss, and I'm really elated to be joined by Robert Palmer. Robert is you're going to just get to love him. He's a fantastic guy. He's just some very innovative stuff. And we're going to get into that in just a second. As always, I'd like to encourage people to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. We're always keen to get as much support as we can. We think these conversations are important. They're not normal in today's world because they're a little bit more thoughtful and deep than a lot of conversations around complicated topics where the listeners typically look for simple answers. And for many of these topics, there aren't simple answers. So with that, let's dive into it. Robert, welcome. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So I want to talk about a new topic. We've been talking a lot on this show about the issues in the healthcare industry. We've talked about broadband as well, but a lot of focus around healthcare for the most recent 5 months or so. And one of the issues that we've been focused on is the issue of pricing transparency. And we've gotten a lot of traction on that. People are very interested in it. Obviously, the prior president, President Trump, signed into law something called the Pricing Transparency Act. And there's been a lot of movement around that. There's not been a lot of compliance with it, but there's been a lot of movement around it. And we've spoken to guys like Leon Wisniewski, who has got a company that's focused on gathering all that data. We've got to talk to another guy who's doing some very, very creative work named Bill Hennessy, who has a company called Prater. And he's also doing some very innovative work around pricing transparency and really bringing that to bear with regard to the consumption of healthcare. But what you're doing is actually really, really intriguing to me, because what you're focused on is, and I'm using your term, protocol transparency. So talk a little bit about your background and how you got interested in this topic.
Yeah, so my training is in economics and building risk models. So talk about predictive models. I've been involved in doing that for nearly 30 years now. And I've worked in many different industries and have been focused on healthcare for going on now 20 years. The original work derived from looking at outcomes in cardiac surgery, and with a key question there is patient acuity, presenting different treatment options based upon the other health problems that the patient has, combined with the treatment options that would layer on over that. So when you talk about protocol transparency, protocols are typically derived from the outcomes of clinical trials, and the participants in the clinical trials are generally younger, healthier, less racially and ethnically diverse populations. And therefore, what we see is a narrow swath of outcomes associated with the definition of protocols. Meanwhile, the general population swath is wide. So big variation in the general population, small variation in the protocol population. Therefore, when you look at do the protocols work for the general population, the answer is questionable.
So already you said so much, and I want to start with something you may not be expecting, a little bit of a curveball. One of the things that's been interesting is I've gotten a lot of requests for interviews and over the last 5 months. And well, that's flattering and nice. What's been interesting is that there are large swaths of the media who don't want to talk to me because I have a JD. I'm a lawyer by training and a kind of a practitioner economist, if you will, who does macro and microeconomic studies for fun, which makes me weird anyway, of course. But what's interesting is that because I don't have an MD at the back of my name, there are large swaths of the media who don't want to talk to me at all about anything related to healthcare or healthcare policy. And one of the things that I like to talk about from a political perspective is the notion that it wouldn't be surprising that cultural change emanates or originates from the arts, comedians and thespians and others who want to challenge the status quo or the trend. So here you are, you're an economist, right? By training, you're doing financial and other risk models, and you bring that lens to bear on the problem of protocols and medical outcomes in a way that most physician groups would not think of, nor even ever consider actually asking you to help with. So how did you break through that barrier first?
Yeah, well, it's an excellent question. It's a barrier that I deal with, frankly, personally. What do I know about this is a question that I would ask myself. And the answer to that is I work closely with clinicians, epidemiologists, biostatisticians. So each of us brings something to the mix that we can measure and that we can add to the models. And it's critically important that I discuss the development of these models with the clinicians, because there are many patient or diagnosis types that don't apply to different procedural approaches, for instance. So if you're looking at metastatic cancer as an example, many times those patients aren't candidates for surgical treatments. Therefore, if we build models around, let's discuss outcomes for metastatic cancer patients that receive surgery, that would be a small group, and many times those patients aren't being treated for cure. It's a palliative treatment. So as someone with a financial background, I have no clue about that. So I would uncover outcomes that would be noisy, and so having the clinicians give us a good idea of what are the well-worn paths within the treatment, within the data sets that we can see. And we can see that from behind the scenes with the size of the sample of different procedures that we see in different patient types. So we can understand what's being done and how frequently. Now, the question is, maybe a rare treatment would have an effect, and we need to be able to uncover that too. So it's a really nuanced question that we need clinicians to weigh in on as well.
And so the idea of it takes a village, right? It takes a number of disciplines to kind of come to look at the problem and bring each of those tool sets to bear on solving it.
Correct. Yeah, and if you have a physician lens, you're really focused on providing treatment to the patient. It's what you're trained to do, and helping them in any way that you can, and you're doing that in large part with a lack of information on a risk-adjusted basis associated with outcomes. So you're doing the best you can with what you know, which is what you were trained to do. And we ask bigger questions. And also from a patient lens, you're coming into a physician to receive treatment. So if you come into a physician's office and he indicates that, with the other health issues you have, or with the age that you're presenting, this treatment may not help and it may harm you. You as a patient may walk away and say, I don't want to work with this physician. I'm going to go to somewhere where they're going to actually provide what I want, which is treatment. Well, meanwhile, the physician may have had your best interests in mind, but you as a consumer of healthcare are really wanting more, because more is certainly better. And also your family is wanting you to be treated. More is certainly better. So this is a really complicated web that patients are in the center of and trying to figure out.
So once again, you said a whole lot there. I want to try and unpack it just a little bit, because I want to underscore the notion that, as a general rule, physicians, nurses, and other clinicians tend to be very, very compassionate and very mission oriented. Their goal is to solve the problem, the healthcare problem that the patient presents to them, and the clinicians want to do so using the best tools at their disposal, and the sum of all their education, which means that the quest, in my view anyway, is noble in intent, but also can be unwittingly or unfortunately limited in perspective. And so in an effort to do this and to solve the problem as quickly as possible, they tend to fall into one of two categories. And this is not unique to clinicians at all. I find this throughout business as well, where you're either a pattern recognizer we're a problem solver. A pattern recognizer says, hey, I've seen something that looks like this before, a fact pattern that looks like this before, so I'm going to apply this solution because it's worked in the past. And what that leads to is simple answers to complex problems. And it's not uncommon that the solution doesn't really work for a whole bunch of reasons, but it's really because the individual hasn't had the time or inclination or tool set to dig deeper. In this instance, and the second instance, there's a problem solver who actually takes a deeper look at the problem, disaggregates the elements of the problem, and then says, okay, now I need to take on a solution. So one of the things that was intriguing about your prior remarks was the set of the population that was involved in the clinical trials being tending to be fairly narrow in terms of its demographic attributes. And so talk a little bit about, for example, just how something like age or race can vary the outcome based on the protocol used.
Right. That's an excellent question. It's foundational to a lot of the work we do. A simple way to put it is sicker patients tend to do worse, and we would all accept that just on face validity. We can also agree that as patients age, they tend to have worse outcomes. Now, combine those factors, and also combine those factors associated with the complications associated with just having the patient in the hospital, for instance. So secondary infections, falls, and so on. So we're taking patients that are by definition fragile, just to need a procedure, and measuring those outcomes associated with the different approaches that we could take is really important. And the challenge that we have with the clinical trial system is, in large part, they're designed to answer different questions. So we're looking at getting a drug approved, isolating different aspects of a treatment. So we're looking at the efficacy and versus effectiveness question, and now we're asking patients to make treatment decisions, physicians to make treatment decisions based upon a design that was meant for a government approval in large part. But what the patients want to know is this clinically significant to me, which is really a different question. And that's where the importance of all the different patient attributes comes into play.
Okay, so it has been a long windup in essence, but I kind of want to put these pieces together. So here's Robert, N number of years ago, who is a smart guy, done a lot of work with math, economics, and finance. And he says, hey, I think I'll just tackle a particularly grim topic. Now, wait a minute. How do you make that leap from going into from the world of finance into the world of what we're calling protocol transparency? What catalyzes that leap from point A to point B, and how could what caused you to feel like that was both a calling and a fulfilling undertaking?
Yeah, so really good question. When I would do work in valuation of companies, that could be in manufacturing, could be in the financial world, that was typical of the work that I did. If I could find a company that had a 5% inefficiency, it was a massive value that we could fix, and it would extrapolate to millions of dollars in equity value within the company for acquisitions, for mergers, for improvements in operations. And the first work that I did in healthcare, I was looking at 50% differentials in improvement, and I'd never seen anything so inefficient, and so that was an eye-opening reality. And also, on the other side of this are people's lives. So we can think about it this in financial terms, but also important are clinical outcomes. And in a lot of the work that we've done, we're seeing 30% of the treatments aren't helping, and therefore, if you go through a procedure that doesn't help, it harms you. And so we're seeing this on both sides of the equation. The clinical aspect really derives the financial outcomes as well, and the inefficiency of the market really compelled me. and also a personal story rolls into this. While I was developing models in cardiac surgery, my own father was diagnosed with metastatic prostate cancer. And now we had a personal question to ask, what treatment options were best for my father. And I assumed in cancer outcomes, there would be much more advanced models available than the work that we were doing in cardiac, but I was wrong on that. There was very little information available for metastatic patients. Everything that I read pretty much made me want to throw up, and the outcomes were so dismal looking, and yet we wanted to do something, which is a natural push. And my dad was otherwise healthy, and surely there was something that could be done. And that, looking back, we made decisions that maybe we would have changed had we had better information. And just going through that process of seeing the effect of not only the cancer, but the addition of treatments to a patient, my dad in this case, who was already frail, was really life-changing to me. And I felt like we could do better. We could play a role in helping to mitigate some of these challenges that families and patients are dealing with, and also mitigate the pain that the patients have to go through.
Well, I'm sorry you went through that personal tragedy, but it sounds like what you're trying to do is really make that into something that's really good for society and for the nation at large, and potentially for other nations at large. So the implication of your tragedy is that you're turning that into something that could be powerful and moving, and really substantially move the needle, not only in terms of saving tremendous amounts of money for the healthcare industry, but far more importantly, saving a tremendous number of lives in the process.
Yeah, and that really is the goal. And that's something that I know my father would have wanted to happen, because he asked many people that went through treatment about their experience. And what he didn't have the awareness of is that actually someone that just went through prostate cancer alone, that wasn't a metastatic patient, really was a different patient group than he was in. Or if he would talk to a breast cancer patient, or someone who went through colon cancer. Now there are aspects that are relevant, but there are many aspects that aren't. And so the ability to personalize this so that we can isolate someone similar in age, someone that's similar in stage, someone that has similar other health issues, is critically important to supporting conversations and in-depth understanding of the trade-offs associated with it. And it really gets back to the wisdom of the crowds, so that if we have a narrow swath of patients participating in clinical trials, those patients aren't reflective of all the outcomes that you might experience. And the other limitation in healthcare is we talk about predictive modeling. It's really difficult to pull that together where it's predictive to you as an individual. Rather, what we work on doing is providing information on, here are the outcomes. You have a 90% chance of survival, so therefore you have a 10% chance of death. I can't tell you if you're in the 90 or 10% group, but at least you go in knowing that these are the odds. And so I think understanding the limitations of what is available today with from a mathematical perspective is also of key importance, so that people don't read too much, but they also don't read too little into the information that's available.
So if you're okay with it, I'd like to kind of walk through the example of your father and the tool that you built and how it might have changed things, if you would. I think that's a powerful story, and has a bunch of implications that I'll dive into with you after that. So
this is a picture of my dad when we found out that he had cancer, and it had spread to his liver and his lung. And it probably had spread to other places in his body that we weren't aware of. The challenge was that he appeared to us to be healthy. So for instance, the morning he was diagnosed with cancer, he jogged 5 miles. He was functioning fine at work. He was looked good. And so the problem that we had was, how could he be so sick And he was really more frail than we knew. He was probably experiencing symptoms that he wasn't sharing with us. And if you could see clearly in this picture, he had a yellow appearance already in his eyes, representing some issues going on with his liver. But with that being said, we wanted to do something. Surely there was something that we could do medically to cure this illness, or at least prolong his life. And that was the starting point that we had on looking at treatment options for my dad. Now, what we didn't have is information on patient outcomes specific to him, meaning that patients were that were his age, with his level of comorbidity and with cancer that already spread. And that had been very helpful for us to level set our understanding, because if you would have asked us, we'd have said, well, potentially he could be treated for cure. Well, that really wasn't even on the table. We didn't understand that fully, and we in large part heard what we wanted to hear. And if we didn't hear what we wanted to hear from a certain physician, we would just go to a different physician where we heard more of what we wanted to hear, and then we would seek treatment from that physician. So that's a common issue that physicians have to deal with patients is expectations. So, and also there have been many studies performed that show that very low percentages of patients, less than 5% of patients can accurately describe their prognosis even after meeting with physicians. And it really isn't the physician's fault. It's the patients hearing what they want to hear. It's it's as you go through treatment, you might hear something from your physician says your tumor's responding to treatment. Therefore, the patient hears they're getting better, that what the physician's saying is I'm buying you time. And so all of these things intertwine with clinical literacy issues, patient misunderstanding, and also unrealistic expectations combined that drive the push towards more treatment must be better. And in my dad's case is a good example where it wasn't better. And I'll move to an output of our models on my dad's case. So what we're looking at here is a chart that shows the probability or likelihood of a patient surviving over 5 years, which is on the horizontal axis in 0 to 5. And then probability of survival, which is in the vertical axis, and you could see 100% survival at the top, 0 at the bottom. And stretching it out to the 5-year estimates in the general population, a person like my father, 69-year-old white male, would have had about a 90% chance of living 5 years. But with the cancer diagnosis that he had, which is the highlight here, doing nothing, he had about a 40% chance of living 5 years.
Okay, so just pause on that for 1 second, if you would. So you said a couple of things that were gating attributes that are important in the protocol on that efficacy analysis, right? Which is your dad was 69 years old, so age is an attribute. He is a white guy, a white person. That's an attribute, and he's a male, which is another attribute. So 69-year-old white male are 3 attributes that drive clinical outcomes. Is that right?
Correct. And in my dad, and there's another attribute, his overall health. He had, in my dad's case, he had mild comorbidity. He had controlled AFib, he had high blood pressure, and some kidney issues in the past. So if you take those into account, he had overall good health, but like many 69-year-olds, he had some other health issues still. So another important attribute to take into account.
Very good. And so what you found is that if you had no treatment, his probability of survival of 5 years, in other words, the chance he would make it and live for another 5 years was 40.6%.
Correct.
And then if he did other things, what happened?
And in my dad's case, which I want to first of all call this out, this is an unusual case. This is an anomaly, but still occurs. In my dad's case, the addition of treatment didn't help his survival. And when we did analysis of patients similar to him that received each one of these treatment modalities, we actually see a worse prospect of survival. And it's very counterintuitive. It's relatively uncommon, but what we've seen here would be very valuable information for us, because then we could go into the physician and have a better baseline understanding that, wow, why is this that his outcomes are so poor and his prognosis is so poor? Well, because he's a metastatic, the cancer is spread, and it spread to his liver and his lung. And so if we added additional treatments, each of these is going to have effect on all the systems. So there's a logical answer to why this is the case, but there's also an emotional component of processing this and understanding that he's a terminal patient, and there is no way that my dad, if you asked me at the time, no, he's healthy, we're going to beat this. That was the sentiment that we carried, even though it was unrealistic. So the ability for outcomes of similar patients that are in large part irrefutable, this is the experience that they had with these different treatment choices, would level set and help us look back and say, we have to accept some of the realities of what we're dealing with, and here are the options that we have based upon the realities that we're dealing with, and we need to make a choice. And the choice may not always be doing more, but in many cases the choice is doing more. So I want to draw that out, that in some patients we see treatment as being incredibly helpful. Otherwise we wouldn't see patients being treated as they do. But it's important to know when you're going in what your expectations are. And it's much different for an early stage prostate cancer patient than in my dad's case, where the cancer had already spread. And in fact, truthfully, they're two different groups of patients when you look at their outcomes.
So I'm looking at this chart and I'm thinking to myself, hey, I'm at the on the left-hand side of this graph. I'm at the starting point at the top and on the left, and I'm a type A guy. I'm a type A personality, and my reaction is, all right, darn it, we're going to tackle this thing full on, head on. We're going to throw every stinking thing we can in the kitchen at it. We're going to leave no stone unturned. And that mentality, that mindset, that framework, and that approach will actually reduce my chance of survival by over half.
That's right. In this case, I mean, so, and that's really the important aspect of looking at these information. I don't want anyone to take away from this that we're killing people with treatment. That's not so. It really depends on you as an individual and what your clinical factors are, whether the treatment is effective for you or not. And that's
so there are 2 points to that statement then that I really want to make sure that everybody anchors on both of them, not just one, which is the first is more treatment is not always better. And the answer as to whether or not more treatment is better in your case is specific to your case.
Correct. And I would also add additional there, it's specific to your values and judgment. Someone might tell you that, look, if you go through this treatment, there's a 3% chance it could improve your survival. And some patients might look at that and you say, well, it's greater than 0, I'm going to do it. Other patients might look at that and say, ask the additional question, well, what is it? What's my quality of life and functioning going to look like during that period of time? And that may override their goal towards lengthening their life. So there's no right answer here. You can't look at a chart like this and say, okay, this is what's right for Todd. This is what's right for Robert. No, this is the information that Todd and Robert need to make a decision, which is a whole different approach that we're trying to take.
Okay, very good. So this one simple graph that I'm sure it took years and millions of patients' data to create and present in such an easy to understand format, raises a whole bunch of questions, right? So the first question is, obviously around the personal issues with your dad, and you unfortunately developed this after your dad had passed. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. So, but it's now being, made good use of to help others figure out what they should be doing. And so, let's talk a little about the economic implications where you and I have a shared history. So all of a sudden you get this answer and you say, holy cow, my dad could have saved a whole lot of money in all probability. The insurance companies could have saved a lot of money. The hospital could have incurred a lot less expense. And far more importantly to me as his son, my dad could have had better than a 2x survival rate chance.
Yeah.
And that's the most important to all of us is, I want my dad to live.
Right.
But what was the reaction to the industry when you highlighted this?
The reactions are really mixed. I mean, so this is obviously disruptive information, and it really changes the way that we would look at outcomes. I don't argue that this is the only information that patients should use to make a treatment choice, not by a long shot, but this is an essential element. I would want to know in every treatment that I would undergo, what are outcomes for individuals similar to me, with an endpoint that matters to me as a patient. So outcomes that matter to patients, critically important to measure, and transparency around clinical outcomes. And so is from an industry perspective, that's challenging because we've in large part built the healthcare system in the United States based upon volumes. And so anything that could affect volumes of treatments would have a big impact on providers. But I don't want to indicate that your providers are driving a problem here necessarily. It's also to patients. We want treatment. We assume that it's going to help. We assume it's going to lengthen our life. So patients are driving a lot of this as well as you can see in incentives from family members layering in. That if you had in my dad's case, me as a son, I would look at this and say, you're telling me you're going to do nothing for my father? Are you kidding me? We're going to go somewhere else that they're going to do something for him. So those are all important aspects for us to take into account when we're looking at, where does the problem lie? The problem lies in many components of the system that are all intermingled, and some of those components are human, and the human components are incredibly complex to untangle.
Yes. So what was the outcome then for your dad?
Yeah. So the takeaway from my dad's case is we did drive towards more treatment must be better. And the result was that my dad died with it in about a year, and he died of the cancer, and he also died of the side effects of treatment. And a takeaway was that the treatment really had a big effect on him, physically, and also from a quality of life perspective. His last year, he was in the hospital more than not. We wanted to travel and do things with him because we knew his time was short. He couldn't do so because he just physically wasn't up to it. And multiple surgeries, staph infections, pulmonary embolisms, all resulted in what you can see as an incredible diminishment physically. And literally this was a 1 year picture of the effect of both the cancer and the treatment on my father right before his death.
I'm so sorry you had to go through this, and I'm sorry your family had to go through this. And it's the only way I think that we can make big changes when something like this happens to an individual who wants to transform the experience into something that can be beneficial to everybody, which is what you've done. And I'm, on behalf of all of us, I'm grateful that you've undertaken this, because I know there's been a tremendous amount of work behind producing something that would appear to be such a simple graph. So I'm deeply grateful for that. So you talked a little bit about the industry and the psychology of the patient and the families wanting more treatment rather than less. What would have been the financial implication of this? Have your dad elected to, or if a cancer patient had elected to take no treatment, for example, what would have been the change in the cost and the price and everything?
Right. At 69, my dad was a Medicare patient at the time of his treatment. And so we all carried the burden, effectively, of my dad's treatment when he received it. And when you look at the direct cost of treatment, radiation, chemotherapy, hormone therapy, my dad's treatment costs alone were in the six-figure range. Now, when you look at additional costs associated with the treatment, staph infection, pulmonary embolism, secondary surgeries associated with the staph infection. He had to have part of his bladder removed. He ended up in the ICU multiple times, in the ambulance, in the emergency room, in the hospital. So if you layer in those additional costs, it would have been well in excess of $250,000. So we as a society, for my dad's case and the outcome that we received, we spent around $400,000 in providing care to my father, and in large part directed by a family that was looking to try to do the best for him, that didn't know better. So when we look at the economic implications of opaqueness associated with outcomes, it's significant.
So we, as the buyers of the service, whether individually or as a society, look at that as cost. But at the same time, the other side of the equation is that hospitals and clinicians look at that as revenue. So I can imagine that your recommendations would not always be well received by the clinicians who would want, whilst they still certainly want the best for the patient, they also may recognize that taking your recommendations may result in a substantial loss of revenue, because it's revenue to them.
Yeah, in the United States, we estimate about 30% of care is not helpful. So when you think about that from a top line perspective, that's a very significant hit from an economic perspective. And I would argue that we could look at it that way, but we could also look at it as an allocation issue, that while 30% of care isn't helpful, there is a whole nother strata of patients that aren't receiving care that otherwise would benefit. So for instance, if we look at early stage colon cancer patients, we could, the more patients that we could find that have cancer at early stages, that we can remove the cancer, we could save the patients having to go through additional treatments that would be indicated for after the cancer has spread. And from a system perspective, we could reallocate that and treat patients at a more effective period during their diagnosis. So, putting our economics hat back on, this isn't a zero-sum game. That it really is, how can we have X amount of capacity to provide, what's the best allocation of the care capacity that we can provide to help the most people. And I think that's a good way to look at how we can go forward with the system.
So I just want to put a fine point on that. So we're saying it's 30% of treatments are either unhelpful or are harmful. And that's a tremendous sum of money and a tremendous number or amount of resources that don't need to be applied to the situations where they are either harmful or unhelpful. And yet, if those resources reallocated, we could save a whole bunch more lives if they were simply allocated to people from whom or for whom they would benefit.
Right.
And so this isn't a question of saying to the medical industry or the healthcare industry, look, guys, we're not asking that you take the hit all as a single body. We're saying, look, let's treat people more effectively by getting the right people the right kinds of treatment, and having them pay for it accordingly, or having the industry pay for it accordingly. But let's not give people the treatments that are harmful or unhelpful.
Right. And I think that's something the whole system can get behind. We could all agree that physicians don't wake up and say, I want to do something that doesn't help. I mean, there truly are. And I'm surrounded by physicians. I work with them every day. They're some of my best friends. Not one of them has indicated to me that, hey, I could sell you this procedure. They're really looking at helping patients. That's why they do it. And if we can align incentives in a way that that they're allowed to do what they do best, and then we could help the system run smoother towards allocating those resources. That's a big ask, but there is a potential to do that.
But this is an educational issue, and one can imagine, because I completely agree with you. I've seldom met, I have met some, but 99.9% of all physicians and all clinicians generally are very mission oriented. They're very compassionate. They want to be helpful. That's why they went to med school in the first place.
Right.
Or they went to nursing school, or they wanted to be a lab tech or whatever. They want to help people. And what's unfortunate is those instances where the economic incentives are not necessarily to help people or to do things that they think will help people, but they don't really have enough information to prove that's correct or not correct. So one can imagine that just exposing your tools to medical schools would be enormously helpful for the industry. Have you had any inquiry from med schools to say, hey, come tell us about this?
Yeah, so the tools were born out of work at medical schools, and one of the original works was with Alvin Feinstein, who was a mathematician who became a clinician. And he indicated that when he became a clinician, he was shocked because how little rigor was involved in the decisions that he made clinically as compared to when he was a mathematician. He would have external review and proof done of his work. And so that would be another way of looking at clinical outcomes. Is we would have external validation done effectively, but not just in a broad spectrum approach, meaning that all patients fit into this treatment guidelines, but rather, what if we had stratified outcomes by patient groups and stratified outcomes by clinical approaches that we could reference, and we could have peer review of those analysis done by clinicians to say, at what point generally are people too old? At what point are generally people too sick to benefit from these treatments?
So it may be interesting to you. I'm sure you know this already, but for those who are watching, the medical industry didn't really embrace the empirical method or the scientific method prior to Abraham Flexner's report coming out in 1910. And it really was, the clinical component of this really didn't come until Sir William Osler infused his observations much later. So it was around the middle of the 20th century when a lot of these issues came to fore. There were dabblings around it, but it was very inconsistent. What Flexner did is, in his evaluation of medical schools in North America, said, hey, we're not really training people to be medical doctors in the right way. And so we need to do it a whole different way. That led to a whole complete revolution in things like state licensing of physicians and hospitals and the like. But it's not been around as long as we would think. So the observation from the mathematician is spot on. It's, we're still fairly young in understanding medicine, notwithstanding what people may think to the contrary. So Let's imagine this. And this is actually, let's not imagine this. This is actually a real story. I have a buddy of mine. He came to me over the weekend. He said, "Hey, Todd, my dad was just diagnosed with stage 1 prostate cancer. And he asked me for a connection to an oncologist, and I gave him one. But now he's been connected to MD Anderson, which is a big cancer hospital here in Texas. And I think it would be helpful, if not powerful, for him to see the output of your tool. How would an individual go about accessing your tools and your technology?
Today, our tools are made available through insurance companies and self-insured employers, primarily being the sponsors of this information. And in large part, the self-insured employers are footing the bill for these medical treatments. And A, they want the best outcomes for their employees. And B, they want a better allocation of cost, because healthcare has been so problematic for them from a budget perspective. And so we would really encourage individuals to ask their insurance companies, ask their employers to allow for outcomes transparency from both a cost and a clinical perspective, because they're really going to push towards this.
Well, individuals are going to care a heck of a lot more about the clinical outcomes than they are about the cost, I can imagine, because at the end of the day, everybody wants to get the problem solved so they can live another day, quite literally live another day.
Right.
But the idea of catalyzing behavior, so that encouraging people to go reach out to their employer and their insurance company is important. Now, we live in the United States, and our model is based on the idea of capitalism, which is brought to bear a ton of innovation in every industry. So I'm not suggesting capitalism is bad at all, but tell me about your experience in talking to other nations about your technology and your tools, and what's their reaction been?
Right. We've been in conversation with a number of countries that have systems of care. So unlike the United States, they're more of a socialist approach to care. Politically, there are arguments around that. We'll just set this aside for the moment and discuss how do they look at it from an allocation perspective. And it really is, when you look at systems of care approach, they have X numbers of units of chemotherapy, for instance, to allocate among a population in their country over a given period of time. And historically, that allocation has been tied to elements that may or may not be useful for a determination of who would best be suited for care. So for instance, we may cut off patients just based upon one factor, which would be age, and say no one over 70-year-old is going to get chemotherapy treatment. Well, that may or may not be a good measure, but let's ask an additional question. What if we have a 50-year-old that has multiple comorbidities, later stage disease, and we're going to allocate a unit to this patient? Or what about a 70-year-old that's otherwise healthy that has early stage disease, and what are the outcomes for those patients? And so a new and different way of looking at it would be, rather than casting patients into broad swaths just based upon one factor, which would be age, what if we added some additional components to this and looked at allocation based upon improving outcomes, improving lives? And so that's the way that many of the different systems of care that we've spoken to are looking at using tools like this.
Which is powerful. They're not saying, hey, we just don't want to spend the money, or we don't want to give it to you. They're saying, hey, we'd love to spend the money, we'd love to give it to you, but it won't help, or it may harm.
Right.
And that's a whole different lens. That's a whole different discussion that's better. And in fact, it may not be that that it won't help. It can, not getting it could actually extend your life. Right.
And we as a society in the United States are dealing more and more with these issues. We have an aging population. Comorbidities are highly prevalent in the populations that are diagnosed with cancer, for example. And so we also, as a society, because these patients are by definition Medicare patients once they get past 70, which is the average age of diagnosis, even though we have a capitalist system here, we're all paying for the Medicare patients, which is the largest group of cancer diagnosis, for instance, that we have in the United States.
Wow. Well, Robert, thank you so much for your time today. This has been such a fascinating conversation. I'm so grateful for your spending the time with me personally, but also spending time with the audience and sharing the story. It's very moving, but I'm also moved by the noble work you're doing to take the unfortunate experience of your father and leverage it into something that's really beneficial for not only our society here in the United States, but really for the world. You're doing important things for the world, and I'm deeply grateful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your time, and we really appreciate your great questions.
We'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching this week's episode of Civil Discourse. To learn more about today's topic or our guest, visit www.the60percentsolution.com or www.tfip.group.